They called it work, but it was closer to a curse. Imagine rising with the dawn only to know that before the sun set, you would have lowered dozens of lifeless bodies into the ground. There was no pause, no dignity, no measured silence of mourning. The cart rolled in, piled with the dead wrapped in torn cloth or left bare, skin marbled with the marks of plague, eyes still open in a frozen stare. A man could not count them one by one. There were too many. So he lifted, dragged, and dropped again and again until his muscles screamed and his breath grew shallow from the stench. The earth was never soft enough, never wide enough, never deep enough to keep up with the flood of corpses that kept coming. And if these forgotten voices found a place in your heart, let your presence here be a gesture of memory. Subscribe and walk with us through these stories. The first days broke something inside. In the beginning, some caveros tried to whisper prayers over each body, crossing themselves, hoping for a spark of mercy. But the rhythm of death was faster than their words. 10 bodies, then 20, then 50 in a single day. It no longer mattered if it was a child with curls still tangled in ribbons, or a merchant still in his fine clothes. All were carried the same way. All were shoveled into the same earth. The arms ached, the spine burned, but the work did not stop. If you stopped, the corpses would rise in numbers behind you like a tide, waiting to drown you in its weight. The bodies were heavier than they looked, bloated by infection, stiffened by rigor. When the men pulled them from the cart, some slipped from their grasp, splitting open on the ground. Blackened fluids seeped into the soil, mixing with mud and sweat. There was no time to clean, no way to turn back. Gloves were rare, cloth masks non-existent, and every touch was a gamble with fate. Yet they lifted again, until their fingers cracked and bled. The earth itself seemed to resist, hardened from the trampling of so many feet, as if it too had grown tired of swallowing the dead. Neighbors watched from their shuttered windows, clutching rosaries, crossing themselves when the carts passed. But no one dared help. To touch a corpse was to invite death into your own lungs, into your own bed. So the caveros labored alone, shadows moving in the daylight, faces covered in grime and fear. They were not heroes. They were condemned men in motion. Some worked because hunger left them no choice, others because no one else would. In their silence, you could hear the truth. Each body buried brought them closer to their own grave. There was no end to the procession. At dawn, carts lined up at the edge of the pits, and by dusk, more carts arrived, as though the dead themselves multiplied in the hours between. Mothers wailed, tossing flowers or scraps of cloth into the dirt before running away. Fathers pressed coins into the caveros' hands, begging for a shallow grave where they could at least remember the spot. But the coins disappeared into calloused palms, and the bodies vanished beneath layers of soil, indistinguishable from the rest. Money could not buy individuality when the earth demanded uniformity. The exhaustion was a constant companion. Arms trembled as shovels sank into the dirt, backs cracked under the endless motion of lifting and dropping. The caveros smelled of sweat, mixed with the iron tang of blood and the sour rot of decomposing flesh. No matter how much they washed, the scent clung, seeping into their hair, their nails, their very skin. Some claimed the smell haunted them, even in sleep, seeping into their dreams until they awoke, gasping, tasting the plague on their tongues. It became a mechanical existence. Body after body, hole after hole. A face became just another shape. A limp hand just another weight to drag. To think too much was dangerous. If you looked into the eyes of a girl no older than your own daughter, you faltered. If you noticed the worn ring on a man's finger, you imagined his wife waiting in a shuttered house, unaware she too might soon join him. Thought was a luxury. Numbness was survival. The caveros learned to see corpses not as people, but as tasks, units of labor, another stone to stack. But every now and then, a detail slipped through the cracks, and the numbness cracked with it. Stories spread among them, whispered in the dark when the shovels rested. Some claimed the dead whispered back, voices escaping through broken teeth and swollen throats. Others said they saw movement, a twitch of a hand, a roll of the eye, and for a moment believed the soul had not yet fully departed. Whether hallucination or truth, it did not matter. The fear lodged deep in their chests all the same. Each body felt like a mirror, showing them their own fate only a breath away. And yet, as the pits filled and carts kept coming, the living learned to harden. Jokes turned coarse, mocking death as if laughter could shield them. Wagers were made on how many bodies a man could haul before his arms gave way. Some carved marks into the wood of their shovels, counting the dead like tallying debts. But no matter how they disguised it, the weight pressed heavier each day. Beneath the forced bravado, there lingered the dread that the next corpse might carry not just the disease, but their own reflection staring back. The caveros did not simply bury the bodies. They buried hope, piece by piece, under layers of dirt. Each shovelful was another reminder that the world as they knew it was collapsing, that life itself was being shoveled into the ground. And as the day stretched and the shadows grew long, they dragged yet another corpse toward the pit, knowing that when they returned tomorrow, the line would be longer, the cart heavier, and the air even thicker with the smell of death. The stench was the first thing that claimed them, long before sickness or exhaustion. It was not just a smell, it It was an invasion. The air carried it like a curse, seeping into the nostrils, sliding down the throat, lodging deep in the lungs, until it became impossible to separate one's own breath from the rot that surrounded them. It clung to hair, to beards, to the folds of woolen tunics, and it did not wash away. Even when a man submerged himself in cold water, scrubbing with rough lye soap until his skin turned raw, the odor lingered, mocking him. His children would turn their faces when he returned home, and wives whispered that they could taste the death on his lips. No fragrance of herbs, no incense burned by priests, no handful of lavender stuffed into pockets could overpower the relentless perfume of decay. It was a scent that shifted with time, mutating as the bodies decomposed. On the first day, it was sharp, almost metallic, like iron scraped across stone, mixed with the faint sweetness of flesh beginning to turn. By the second, it grew heavier, sour and cloying, filling the back of the throat until men gagged mid-shovel. By the third, it was unbearable, a dense, oily rot that coated the tongue and made water taste foul. The worst were the bodies that split open as they were moved, releasing a cloud so potent that men stumbled, coughing, eyes watering, hands trembling as they forced themselves to continue. Some swore the smell wormed its way beneath their skin, that they could feel it leaking from their pores no matter where they went. The villagers knew it too. They barred their doors and stuffed cloth into the cracks of their shutters, desperate to keep the odor out, but it crawled through the streets like a living thing. At night, when the air cooled, the fog of decomposition spread lower to the ground, drifting into alleys, seeping into homes. Mothers pressed cloth soaked in vinegar against the noses of their children, but the little ones still woke, retching, coughing, crying that they could not escape it. The city was suffocating under the invisible hand of its own dead, and at the center of it were the coveros, men so steeped in the smell that they were treated as walking corpses themselves. They spoke of it with dread, but also resignation. One man claimed the stench haunted him even in dreams. He would awaken gasping, convinced he was buried under the same earth he had shoveled onto others. Another confessed that he had lost all taste for food. Bread tasted like dust, meat like rot, wine like vinegar gone sour. Nothing escaped the corruption of the plague's odor, and so he wasted away, not from sickness, but from the inability to eat without gagging. The irony was cruel. They risked their lives to keep others from choking on the presence of the dead, and in return they were forced to live in a world where every breath was a reminder of it. Some tried to shield themselves. They tied rags over their mouths, dipped in vinegar or crushed herbs, hoping to filter the air. A few carried little pouches of rosemary, thyme, or cloves, clutching them to their noses as they bent over the corpses. But the effort was futile. The power of the stench was greater than any charm or preparation. Within minutes, the herbs wilted, the vinegar lost its bite, and the rags grew damp with breath and filth. The coveros understood that there was no protection against it. Only endurance separated the living from madness. Children in the streets mocked them, holding their noses and chanting that the coveros carried death in their pockets. Women crossed themselves and stepped aside when they passed, as though the very air around them was poisoned. Even priests hesitated to approach too closely, offering blessings from a distance, as if words could shield them where cloth could not. The men grew used to the isolation, but not to the humiliation. To carry the stench of the dead was to be marked, to be branded as less than human. They became outcasts not by choice, but by necessity, exiled in plain sight. And yet, in the strangest of ways, the smell also became familiar, almost a part of them. A man could wake in the dark and know without opening his eyes that he was still alive, because the stench was there to greet him. It was proof of his existence, twisted and cruel, but real. Without it, the silence might have been worse. There were moments when the scent would dull, when the wind shifted or rain washed the streets, and instead of relief, they felt panic. The absence of it felt unnatural, like the silence before a storm. They knew it would return, stronger, heavier, more unforgiving, and so they braced themselves. The true horror was not only that the smell clung to the body, but that it clung to memory. Years later, those who survived swore they could summon it instantly, as vivid as the day they shoveled dirt onto their first pit. It lived in their bones, waiting, a scar invisible but unhealed. Some could not bear to enter a butcher's shop, the faint scent of raw meat enough to send them fleeing. Others avoided markets, terrified by the mingled odors of sweat, animals, and fish, each note reminding them of what they had endured. The stench of the plague was not just a moment in time, it was a lifelong sentence. Still, they carried on, because there was no choice. Each day they woke and breathed the same foul air, forcing themselves to shoulder the weight of corpses despite the bile that rose in their throats. And as they worked, the smell grew stronger, thicker, and the line between the living and the dead blurred in ways no one wanted to admit. The Caviros wondered how long a man could walk through the stench of death before it ceased to cling only to his clothes and began to live inside his very flesh. And with that thought, every breath became not just a struggle, but a silent countdown. The earth never rested. It was forced open again and again, turned inside out by the hands of men who no longer knew what it meant to stop. Digging became their existence, their bodies bending to the rhythm of the shovel striking the soil. The sound was constant, a hollow scrape followed by the thud of loosened dirt, repeated so many times it became almost like a heartbeat. At first, they dug graves for individuals, a man here, a child there, each body lowered with at least a gesture toward dignity. But within weeks, the land could no longer keep pace. One grave was not enough. 10 were not enough. So the caveros were ordered to carve open the ground into vast trenches, valas colectivas, that swallowed entire cartloads of bodies at once. Each trench stretched wide and deep, lined by the shadows of men bent over their work. The soil grew harder as it was churned and compacted daily, as though the earth itself resisted being disturbed so often. The men's hands blistered, then calloused, then split open again, the wounds filled with dirt that stung like fire. They worked with tools so worn that a shovel blade was sometimes thinner than parchment. Some resorted to their bare hands, clawing through mud and clay when tools snapped under the strain. It was a labor without pause, a contest against both time and death, where the penalty for falling behind was to let bodies pile up in the streets. The trenches were dug quickly, too quickly for care. They sloped unevenly, walls crumbling, earth collapsing inward as if nature herself tried to reclaim the dead before the living could bury them. When rain came, the pits filled with water, turning into grotesque swamps where bodies floated until the men returned to push them down with poles. And yet, even in such conditions, the digging continued. They shoveled in daylight under the unrelenting sun, sweat stinging their eyes, and at night by torchlight, their shadows jerking grotesquely across the mounds of earth. There was no end to it, no horizon beyond the next pit, no reprieve except for the exhaustion that eventually forced their muscles into brief, dreamless sleep. The men's bodies changed under the burden. Muscles thickened from endless lifting, backs bent, joints swelled. Their palms were as rough as the stone they sometimes struck beneath the soil. Some could no longer stand fully upright, their spines permanently bent toward the ground as if the earth had claimed them too. Their nails were perpetually blackened, the skin of their arms scratched raw by brambles and broken wood. And yet, none of this compared to the deeper exhaustion, the mental numbness that set in when a man realized he had dug so many trenches that he could no longer remember where one ended and another began. Villagers occasionally wandered to the edges of these pits, staring down at the yawning earth with terror. They whispered that the trenches resembled mouths, vast, insatiable mouths that could never be filled. Children asked their mothers whether the ground itself was alive, eating the people it was supposed to protect. Some believed the pits were cursed, that the soil drank too much blood and would never grow crops again. For the caveros, these stories were not superstition but truth. They had seen the ground spit back bodies during storms, coffins rising like ghosts when the trenches overflowed. They had stood knee-deep in mud mixed with flesh and bone, and they knew that the earth had grown tired of the dead. The routine of digging became ritual. Men timed their shovels to each other, moving in rhythm so that one stroke followed another in a grim chorus. When one faltered, another stepped in, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. If the digging stopped, the carts of bodies stalled and the smell grew unbearable. They measured their days, not in hours, but in how many feet of soil they managed to open. They competed silently, though no man wanted to win. A trench completed was not a triumph. It was only an invitation for another cartload of corpses to arrive. There were moments when the work blurred into hallucination. Men swore the earth shifted under their feet, that the ground breathed like a living thing. Others claimed to hear sounds beneath the soil, groans, whispers, even laughter, as though the dead below were mocking their efforts. Some spat on the dirt, cursing it, while others crossed themselves, terrified that to insult the earth was to invite it to swallow them alive. Whatever they believed, none dared stop digging. To question was to risk madness, and madness was a luxury the plague would not forgive. Tools were scarce, and replacements rarer still. When shovels broke, men reforged blades from scraps of iron or sharpened wood into crude spades. The handles splintered, slicing into their palms, but still they worked. One cavero used the femur of a corpse to dig after his shovel snapped, hacking at the earth with bone until another tool could be found. Such improvisations were whispered about with unease, yet no one condemned them. In times when death ruled every street, even desecration became necessity. The work was endless, but it was not silent. The clang of iron, the thud of falling dirt, the grunt of straining men, all blended into a constant dirge. Birds that once filled the fields abandoned the trenches, repelled by the noise and the stench. The only creatures that remained were the rats, bold enough to run across open ground, darting between piles of fresh dug soil, their fur slick with filth. The caveros cursed them, striking at them with shovels when they drew too near, but there were always more. It was as if the rats themselves knew the trenches would never be empty. When the silence of history grows heavy, only together can we keep the memory alive. Join us by subscribing so that none of these voices fade away. And when the day ended, when the last shovel was thrust into the mound and the men staggered home, they carried the trenches in their minds. They dreamed of falling into pits that never reached a bottom, of digging only to find their own families staring back at them from the soil. They woke with a taste of dirt in their mouths, as though the earth had already claimed a part of them. And yet, when dawn broke, they returned to the same pits, the same tools, the same endless task, because the dead were waiting and the earth was hungry still. Rats ruled the streets as much as the plague itself. They scurried in broad daylight, their black eyes glittering as if mocking the men who struggled to bury the dead. They poured out of cellars, swarmed through abandoned houses, and infested the carts that carried bodies to the pits. Caveros often had to shake them off corpses before lowering them into the trenches, their sharp teeth already gnawing through flesh. Some rats grew so bold that they climbed over the men's boots as they worked, darting between shovels, slipping into pockets of soil with uncanny ease. It was impossible to avoid them. They were not merely a nuisance. They were companions in this landscape of death, thriving on what the humans tried to hide beneath the ground. The Caveros quickly learned that to work was also to battle. A shovel was not only for digging, but for striking at the rodents when they came too close. Some men carried sticks and swung at the creatures as if fighting invisible soldiers in an endless war. Yet for every rat killed, 5 more seemed to emerge, bold and unafraid. The men swore the animals grew fatter each day, feeding not just on scraps of bread left in deserted kitchens, but on the very bodies they were supposed to bury. The bloated shapes of rats, their bellies rounded from feasting on human flesh, became a common sight around the pits. More insidious were the fleas. Tiny, nearly invisible, they were the true carriers of the Black Death, though few understood it at the time. To the Caveros, they were an irritation at first. A bite here, a red welt there, an itch that never ceased. But soon, the bites turned into fever, fever into buboes, and buboes into death. Men who had labored side by side, laughing grimly about the constant scratching of their skin, were carried away days later in the same carts they had once unloaded. It was as though the plague had embedded itself in their very clothing, using their labor as its vehicle. The men tried crude defenses. Some rubbed garlic into their skin, believing the sharp odor would repel the vermin. Others smeared vinegar over their arms and legs, though it burned and left raw patches behind. A few tied bundles of dried herbs to their belts, sage, thyme, rosemary, hoping their scent would keep the pests away. But nothing worked for long. The fleas jumped regardless, their tiny bodies carrying death from rat to man, from man to child, until the line between host and victim blurred completely. It was not unusual for a Cavero to feel his skin crawling with invisible movement while lowering a corpse into the pit, realizing too late that the fleas had abandoned one body to feast on another still alive. At night, when the men tried to rest, the scratching was relentless. Their beds were infested, their blankets alive with what could not be seen clearly in the candlelight. Some burned their straw bedding and slept on bare ground, preferring the chill of the floor to the torment of constant bites. Others drank heavily, hoping that drunkenness would numb both itch and fear. But even through the haze of alcohol, they could not escape the crawling sensation, the phantom pricks of teeth and legs that reminded them that the plague never left their side. The rats themselves seemed to grow fearless, as though emboldened by the silence of the cities. Markets once bustling with merchants were now deserted, leaving grain stores unguarded. Cellars brimmed with barrels of flour, wine, and salted meat, abandoned by owners who had fled or died. The rats tore through sacks, spread filth across floors, and multiplied in darkness. Caveros often joked bitterly that when all the humans were gone, the rats would inherit the earth. Yet behind the humor was a truth that gnawed at them. They were already outnumbered, already losing ground to creatures that thrived where humanity crumbled. One story passed between the men, told of a Cavero who, in desperation, tried to train a pack of dogs to keep the rats at bay while he worked. For a time, it seemed to succeed. The dogs barked and snapped, scattering rodents into the shadows. But within weeks, the dogs grew sick, their fur patchy, their bellies swollen. They lay down beside the pits and never rose again. The Cavero buried them with his own hands, then returned to the same labor, now surrounded once more by the unchallenged squeal of rats. The tale spread as a warning. Even the strongest animals could not survive long in a world where fleas carried death as efficiently as arrows in battle. The fleas did not discriminate. They moved from rats to men, from men to children, from children to priests. They turned every home, every trench, every workshop into a battlefield no one could see. And still the Caveros dug, their arms covered in red bites, their legs raw from scratching, their minds haunted by the knowledge that each sting might be the beginning of their end. Some scratched until their skin broke open, sores that oozed beneath filthy fingernails, wounds that festered quickly in the unclean air. They wore their suffering as visibly as the dirt on their clothes, and the people of the city began to avoid even their shadows. To be near a Cavero was to invite the fleas to leap onto your own flesh. This isolation deepened their misery. Children pointed at them in the streets, whispering that the rats followed them like disciples, that their very presence summoned vermin. Some households barred their doors when they saw the men pass, as if rats and fleas would slip inside behind them. The caveros became not just laborers of death, but its symbols, walking reminders of the infestation that ravaged every alley. They were both necessary and unwanted, relied upon, yet despised, bound forever to the creatures that spread the very disease they fought to contain. In the end, the rats and fleas were not just pests, they were the plague itself given form. And as the men bent over another trench, pushing away rats with their boots while slapping at fleas burrowing into their skin, they could not help but wonder if the true curse of their work was not in the bodies they buried, but in the creatures that refused to be buried at all. The promise of payment was a bitter joke. The men who dug graves and carried the dead were offered coins, so few they barely kept bread on the table, and yet those coins carried a heavier curse than gold ever should. To earn money from death was to carry a brand upon one's soul. The townspeople whispered that the caveros were profiting from misery, though in truth their wages were pitiful. Still, every coin pressed into their filthy palms came with suspicion, as if the silver itself had been touched by pestilence. Some shops refused their money outright, claiming it reeked of disease. Others accepted it reluctantly, tossing the coins into bowls of vinegar before placing them into their tills. Payment was not respect. It was merely another reminder that the men were both needed and despised. The danger was constant. Every body they lifted, every shovel of soil they tossed was a gamble. The swollen lumps on the corpses, the blackened skin, the foul ooze that leaked through rotting clothes, all were silent threats, invisible arrows aimed at the men who dared approach. To touch the dead was to risk joining them, and yet there was no other way. They carried the bodies on their shoulders, sometimes dragging them by ropes when the weight grew unbearable. The cloth sacks used to cover the corpses often tore, spilling limbs or fluids onto the ground. A man could be splashed in the face with the contents of a bubonic sore and have no choice but to wipe it away with his sleeve and continue. Every touch was a test of fate, and fate was rarely kind. The work was not just physical, but psychological. Many caveros lived with the knowledge that their labor was a death sentence. They spoke in hushed voices of comrades who had disappeared from the trenches, struck down by sudden fever. One day, a man would be beside them, coughing into his sleeve, insisting he could work. The next, he was gone, his body carried on the very same cart he once unloaded. No profession devoured its workers so quickly, and no amount of coin could erase the dread that gnawed at them. They were digging their own graves, stroke by stroke, and they knew it. To make matters worse, those meager wages often went unpaid. City coffers were drained, priests hoarded what donations they could, and wealthy merchants fled with their fortunes. The caveros were left waiting, sometimes for weeks, for coins that never came. Some demanded their pay up front, refusing to work without it, but desperation always forced them back. Hunger was as powerful a master as plague, and an empty stomach could not be ignored. A man with children at home learned quickly that he could not afford pride. He took the job again, even when payment was doubtful, because survival was worth more than dignity. There were moments when despair nearly overcame them. Some abandoned the work entirely, fleeing the city for distant villages in hopes of escaping both labor and disease. Yet flight rarely brought salvation. Those who ran were often turned away at city gates, branded as carriers of death. Starvation claimed many before the plague itself could reach them. Ironically, it was those who stayed behind, enduring the unending cycle of corpses and coin, who sometimes lasted longer. Their lives were miserable, but misery was at least a kind of endurance. The townspeople never saw the truth of the labor. To them, the caveros were shadows dragging carts, figures glimpsed at the edges of alleys. They did not see the trembling hands as a man counted his few coins by candlelight, or the way he hid his wages under loose stones in the floor, fearing theft as much as disease. They did not see the way he hesitated before touching his own child, worried that the plague clung to his skin and would pass through his touch. Payment was not a reward, but a chain, binding him to a life that few would ever envy. And yet, there was a strange pride among them. The men knew they were the last line between chaos and collapse. Without their work, the streets would drown in corpses, the air would choke with rot, and the city itself would become unlivable. The pay was meager, but the necessity was undeniable. Some whispered that God himself had chosen them for this task, that only the damned or the blessed could survive such a burden. They did not know which they were, but they worked as though eternity depended on their shovels. If the echo of this journey reached you, your subscription becomes the thread that keeps the flame of truth burning beneath the earth. Even so, the balance between payment and risk remained cruel. A man might work for weeks, risking his life daily, only to be struck down before he could spend his wages. His coins would remain in a pouch on the table, untouched, while his body was lowered into the very trench he had dug. Other men would see those abandoned coins as a warning. Death took not just the flesh, but the fruits of labor as well. The money was cursed, a temporary comfort at best, and a mocking reminder of how fragile survival truly was. And still they returned, day after day, hand outstretched for another coin, shoulder bent for another corpse. They had no illusions. They were not gathering wealth, not building futures, not saving their families from the specter of plague. They were simply buying time, A handful of days carved from the jaws of death. That was all their wages amounted to. The purchase of one more sunrise, one more chance to return home and see their children breathing in their beds. The coins jingled in their pockets, but it was not wealth they carried. It was the sound of their own mortality, measured in copper and silver, waiting for the day when even payment could no longer keep them from the grave. They were men who walked among the living, yet carried the mark of the dead. The caveros were not only avoided, they were shunned as if cursed. The very people who relied on their labor crossed streets to escape them, pulled their children indoors at the sight of their shadows, and whispered prayers when they passed. Their boots left prints in the mud, and neighbors refused to step in them, claiming that even the earth beneath their feet carried contamination. To be a gravedigger during the plague was to exist in exile, cut off not by distance but by fear. At first, some had tried to preserve their place in the community. They went to taverns after long nights of digging, hoping to sit among others, to drink and share stories. But mugs were taken from their hands and benches emptied around them. The innkeepers would not touch the coins they offered without using cloth or tongs, and more than once, a man was shoved back into the street before he could speak. Others tried to visit churches, but even priests hesitated to bless them. The smell of rot clung too tightly, the sight of dirt under their nails too sharp a reminder of what their hands had touched. Soon they stopped trying altogether, learning that silence was safer than rejection. At home, life was not kinder. Wives and children recoiled from embraces, turning their faces to avoid breath that smelled of decay and vinegar-soaked rags. Some women slept in separate rooms, covering themselves in layers of fabric as though cloth alone could protect them. Others left entirely, fleeing to relatives in the countryside and leaving the men alone with their labor. The caveros often found themselves eating meals in solitude, their bowl separate, their bread untouched by others. Family ties withered under the weight of fear, and loneliness became as constant a companion as exhaustion. Children in the streets mocked them with cruel songs. They would pinch their noses, calling them friends of the worms or husbands of death. Some threw stones, daring each other to see who would come closest before the cavero noticed. The men endured it silently because to lash out was to risk further isolation. Their dignity was eroded piece by piece, not by the work itself, but by the contempt it inspired. To carry the dead was to be marked as unclean, as though the plague resided permanently in their flesh. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, claiming the caveros were not merely workers, but chosen by death itself. Some believed they were immune, that their closeness to corpses granted them unnatural protection. Others suspected the opposite, that the men carried the sickness without symptoms, spreading it unknowingly with every breath. In both cases, they were feared more than pitied. Doors closed when they passed, shutters slammed, and silence followed them down alleys, as though the city itself rejected their presence. Yet the irony was cruel. Without the caveros, the towns would have drowned in corpses, the streets would have become rivers of decay, and the air itself unbreathable. They were the invisible scaffolding that kept society from collapsing entirely, and yet they received only suspicion in return. Their labor prevented panic, allowed markets to reopen, and gave priests space to conduct rituals. But still, they remained pariahs. It was as if their sacrifice was so immense that others could not bear to look at them, lest they be reminded of what survival demanded. The isolation seeped deeper with time. Friendships dissolved as companions who once shared laughter now turned away. Even the simple act of buying food became a struggle. Bakers refused to hand loaves directly into their palms, tossing them across counters or demanding they leave coins on the ground before receiving anything in return. Water carriers would not share a jug, forcing the caveros to draw from wells late at night when others were asleep. Their lives shifted into the margins, shadows moving only when the rest of the world looked away. Some grew bitter, their voices sharp with anger whenever they did speak. They cursed the townspeople for their cowardice, spitting into the dirt as they passed shuttered houses. Others turned inward, becoming silent figures who avoided eye contact altogether. They wrapped themselves in their work like armor, convincing themselves that if society would not accept them, they would find belonging in the trenches instead. The dead did not judge, did not mock, did not flinch from touch. Among corpses, they were not outcasts. They were necessary. Still, isolation wore down even the hardest spirits. Men who once endured hardship with stoic silence began to falter. Some spoke of hearing voices at night, whispers that seemed to rise from the earth they had shoveled. Others swore they saw shadows following them, figures lingering at the edges of alleys. Madness crept in quietly, born not from the plague itself, but from the emptiness of living without touch, without comfort, without acknowledgement of one's humanity. The greatest cruelty was that this exile extended beyond life. When a cavero died, whether by plague, exhaustion, or despair, there was rarely anyone left to mourn him. His comrades buried him quickly, lowering him into the same ground he had opened for others. No prayers, no candles, no family gathered around the grave. Just another body in the endless line of bodies, his work and his suffering swallowed by the silence of a city that had already turned its back. And yet, despite being avoided, despised, and forgotten, The Caveros returned each morning to their shovels and their carts. They endured the loneliness because the alternative was chaos. They bore exile because someone had to bear it. Their lives became testimonies to a paradox, men essential to survival, yet treated as though they had already died. And as they lifted another corpse into the pit, they wondered not only how much longer they could endure, but whether the world would ever remember what their sacrifice had truly cost. There were days when the corpses arrived faster than the shovels could break the ground. Bodies left in the streets, slumped against doorways, or piled into carts, often remained untouched for hours, sometimes days, before the Caveros could reach them. The delay was not from negligence, but from sheer impossibility. There were too many dead and too few hands to carry them. By the time a corpse was lifted, it was already swollen with gases. The skin stretched taut and shiny, as though about to burst. Faces darkened to shades of purple and black, lips split, and bellies ballooned grotesquely. Death was no longer peaceful repose. It was violent transformation, and the men forced to handle it lived with the memory etched into their eyes. The weight of decomposition made each task unbearable. When a body lay too long in the heat, the flesh softened, and the skin tore at the slightest touch. A man lifting by the shoulders could find the arms sliding off like wet cloth, leaving him gripping bones slick with fluids. The stench was overwhelming, a choking fog that no vinegar rag could mask. Sometimes, the pressure inside the corpse released with a sickening sound, a rupture that sprayed the men with filth. They did not flinch outwardly. There was no time for weakness. But inside, each moment of contact carved another scar upon the mind. Clothes offered no protection. Fabric rotted quickly, sticking to the skin it once covered, fusing with it until both decayed together. When the Caveros pulled at garments to lift a body, the cloth shredded in their hands, leaving skin behind like peeling bark. Maggots squirmed openly, spilling from sleeves, mouths, and open sores, crawling over the men's wrists before being brushed away. Rats often reached the corpses first, gnawing at cheeks, fingers, or eyes. The Caveros would strike them aside with shovels, but the damage was already done, the evidence of teeth forever carved into flesh. The carts themselves became symbols of horror. Laden with bodies stacked like firewood, they rolled unevenly through the streets, leaving trails of dark fluid behind their wheels. Sometimes a hand or foot dangled over the edge, swaying with each bump of the road, as though waving a grotesque farewell. The Caveros were forced to lift them one by one, prying stiffened limbs apart when rigor mortis locked them together. Their gloves, if they had any at all, tore quickly, leaving skin bare against the icy chill of death. Each cart delivered not only bodies, but despair, for with every arrival the men realized how little progress they had made. Villagers who dared step outside watched in silence, their faces pale, eyes wide, hands pressed against their mouths. Mothers pulled children close, forbidding them to look, but the curious always peeked. For some, the sight of a swollen body sliding from a cart was enough to send them running in terror. Others fainted outright, the reality of decay too much to bear. And yet, for the Caveros, this spectacle was routine. What horrified the city was for them merely another day's labor, another grim task to endure. There was no order to the work. The men dragged bodies by ropes, by arms, by legs, whatever part could hold without slipping. They tried to move quickly, but speed often meant clumsiness, and clumsiness meant tearing. A body dropped could burst like an overripe fruit, and the Caveros cursed loudly when it happened, not out of disrespect, but out of frustration. Every accident meant more filth on their clothes, more risk of disease, more time lost. Yet no one stopped. Even as bile rose in their throats, they lifted again because behind them, more carts waited. The fear of infection was always present, hovering like a shadow over their shoulders. They watched each other closely for signs, a cough, a fever, a blotch upon the skin. When one man fell ill, his comrades knew it would not be long before he joined the very corpses he once carried. But the work did not pause for grief. They buried him quickly, perhaps with a muttered word, and returned to the next body. Death had become so common that even mourning had lost its shape, replaced by the mechanical rhythm of survival. The psychological toll was immense. Some men began to speak of the corpses as if they were alive. They swore they saw eyelids flutter or lips twitch as they lowered bodies into pits. One claimed that a woman's hand tightened around his wrist as he tried to move her, though she had been dead for days. Whether hallucination or the cruel tricks of rigor mortis, the fear was real. To touch the dead was to invite the imagination to rebel, to whisper that perhaps the plague was not the only horror at work, that something darker lingered in the silence of the pits. Still, the Caveros could not allow themselves to hesitate. Hesitation meant slowing the line, meant letting more corpses rot in the streets. They hardened themselves against the grotesque details, forcing their minds to numbness. A maggot-ridden face became just another face. A bloated belly splitting open became just another obstacle. They laughed bitterly at what others would scream to see because laughter was the only shield left. But deep down, the images stayed, replaying in the quiet moments of night. When they closed their eyes, they saw the carts again, the torn flesh, the way bodies slid against each other like a cargo. Sleep offered no refuge. It only returned them to the work they could never escape. And so the corpses piled higher, the delays grew longer, and the decay worsened. For every body buried, two more appeared, waiting. The men began to realize that they were not burying the dead to restore order. They were burying to keep from being buried themselves under the crushing weight of numbers. The pits were no longer graves. They were the city's lungs, gasping under the pressure of too much death, demanding more soil, more labor, more sacrifice. And as each body fell into the ground, the Caveros understood that their fight was not just against death, but against the overwhelming tide of what it left behind. The sound of church bells once marked the rhythm of life. They rang for births, for marriages, for Sunday prayers, for the passing of a single soul. But during the plague, the bells grew silent. At first, they rang constantly, tolling for every death until the air itself seemed heavy with the metallic echo of mourning. Then, as the numbers grew too vast, the bells stopped altogether. Priests could no longer keep up, and the constant ringing became unbearable to those still alive. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was as if heaven itself had turned its face away, abandoning the city to its fate. For the Caveros, who worked with spades instead of scripture, this silence was another burden pressing down on their hearts as they shoveled dirt onto countless bodies without a prayer to accompany them. There had been rituals once. Each corpse was to be sprinkled with holy water, blessed with words meant to guide the soul to eternal rest. Families gathered around, weeping, clutching candles, their grief softened by the hope of salvation. But when dozens died in a single street each day, such rituals became impossible. Priests fainted from exhaustion, holy water ran out, candles were consumed faster than they could be made. Soon, the ceremonies faded into memory, and the Caveros were left to fill the void. They buried without words, without symbols, without sanctity. The act became mechanical. A body lowered, a shovel of dirt tossed, another space prepared. To them, the bodies no longer represented souls on their way to heaven. They were obstacles to be removed before the air thickened with stench. Some priests tried to adapt, climbing onto carts and blessing dozens of bodies at once with a hurried gesture of the hand. Others stood at the edges of trenches, mumbling prayers too softly to be heard, their voices drowned by the scraping of shovels. The Caveros noticed how even men of faith faltered, their confidence wavering as the scale of death outstripped their belief in divine order. What good was a prayer when hundreds were buried without names? What comfort could be offered when children and priests lay side by side in the same pit? Faith, once unshakable, cracked under the weight of reality, and with it, the fragile hope of the survivors began to crumble too. For the Caveros, the absence of ritual was especially cruel. They had grown up in a world where funerals were sacred events, where each death was marked with dignity. Now, they stood in fields filled with shallow trenches, tossing dirt over bodies with no farewell, no recognition, no final words. They knew what it meant. The souls of the dead were left adrift, unmoored, without the guidance their traditions promised. Even those hardened by endless labor sometimes crossed themselves quickly, muttering fragments of prayers as if to soothe their own fear rather than bless the dead. But there was no time for more. Another cart was always waiting. The people noticed this too. Families begged the Caveros to bury their loved ones separately, offering coins or food in exchange for just a few words over the grave. But most of the time their pleas were in vain. The dead were too many, the ground too crowded, the work too urgent. A father who begged for his daughter to be buried with a rosary in her hands often found her body tossed into a pit with dozens of strangers, the rosary lost in the dirt. Mothers who prayed for one last chance to kiss their child's forehead were pushed away, told it was too dangerous, that the living must keep their distance. Grief turned bitter, not because of the loss alone, but because the loss came without closure. Superstition began to fill the void left by religion's collapse. Some whispered that unblessed bodies rose at night, wandering the streets, seeking the prayers denied to them. Others claimed that the silence of the bells meant God had abandoned them entirely, leaving demons to roam freely among the pits. The Caveros heard these whispers and carried them into their work. When shadows flickered in torchlight, when wind hissed through trenches at night, men muttered nervously about restless souls. Fear of disease was heavy, but fear of the supernatural pressed even closer. In a world stripped of ritual, imagination made its own horrors. The absence of ceremony also changed the living. Death became ordinary, stripped of its sacredness, reduced to logistics. People no longer gathered in mourning. They stayed inside, shutting out the world. Coffins, once carefully carved, became hastily nailed boards or disappeared altogether. Graves, once marked with names, were now anonymous earth. Life blurred into survival, and survival blurred into numbness. To live without ritual was to live without meaning, and meaninglessness hollowed the city as surely as plague hollowed the body. The Caveros bore this hollowness like a second skin. They could not forget the faces of the unblessed dead, the children laid in the dirt with no candles, the women buried without a final prayer, the priests themselves lowered without the rites they had once performed for others. Every unmarked grave was a reminder that something essential had been stolen, not only from the dead, but from the living, and yet there was no way back. No matter how heavy their shovels felt, no matter how many times they paused to glance skyward, the work never stopped. What haunted them most was the silence of bells that once rang in comfort, the silence of priests whose voices had faded into exhaustion, the silence of streets where no mourners gathered. It was a silence deeper than the grave itself, one that stretched across the city like a shroud. The Caveros lived within it, worked within it, carried it in their chests. And when night fell and the wind rattled through broken windows, that silence followed them home, pressing against their ears like the weight of earth on a coffin lid. In the end, silence became its own kind of ritual. It replaced prayers, replaced hymns, replaced the tolling of bells. It was the only constant left, as faithful as death itself. And as the Caveros bent to their endless labor, they realized that the silence was not just around them, it was inside them too, filling the spaces where grief and faith had once lived. It was this silence, more than the plague, more than the stench, more than the endless pits, that reminded them that the world they had known was gone and that nothing would ever sound the same again. The Caveros lived with a constant shadow at their backs, the fear that every cough, every shiver, every bead of sweat on their foreheads was the beginning of their end. They knew the signs of the plague better than anyone, for they had seen them etched into countless bodies lowered into the ground. It always began the same way: a sudden weakness, a tightening in the chest, a dry cough that quickly deepened into something more sinister. Then came the fever, hot and merciless, burning through the body until the skin glistened with sweat. But the true mark, the sign that no man could deny, was the swelling of the buboes, those blackened lumps that grew under the arms, along the neck, or in the groin. Once they appeared, death was not just a possibility, it was an inevitability. Every day, the Caveros searched themselves for these signs, touching their necks in secret, pressing their armpits, watching their skin in candlelight for the faintest discoloration. They lived as men on borrowed time, each breath a question without an answer. Some tried to convince themselves they were immune, that handling the dead so often had hardened them against the disease. Others laughed bitterly, saying they were only delaying what would surely come. The truth hung between them. None of them were safe, and each hour spent in the pits was an hour closer to their own burial. The fear was sharpened by the stories they carried. They had seen how quickly it struck. One of their comrades might be laughing at a grim joke in the morning, swinging his shovel with practiced rhythm, only to collapse by evening with sweat pouring down his face. The transformation was brutal. Strong men with calloused hands and thick muscles melted into trembling figures who could barely lift a cup of water. Some begged to be buried alive rather than endure the agony, while others clawed desperately at their skin as though trying to rip the sickness out. Within days, sometimes hours, they were gone. The same hands that had dug graves for strangers now dug one more for a friend. It was not just death they feared, but the way it claimed the body. The plague disfigured as much as it destroyed. Skin darkened until it looked charred, lips cracked and bled, eyes clouded and bulged. Some bodies swelled grotesquely, limbs ballooning with infection, while others shriveled into husks, drained of life before the breath had fully left them. For men who handled these corpses daily, it was impossible to separate themselves from the image. When they looked into the faces of the dead, they often saw themselves reflected, faces that had once smiled, eaten, spoken, now twisted into horror. The line between the living and the dead grew thin, fragile, and it terrified them. They developed rituals of their own to manage the fear. Some wore the same talisman each day, convinced that breaking the routine would invite illness. Others carried cloves of garlic in their pockets, chewing them until their mouths burned, hoping the sharpness would cleanse their lungs. A few rubbed vinegar into their skin until it stung, believing it built a wall between them and the sickness. These were not protections grounded in truth, but in desperation, for even the illusion of control was better than surrendering to despair. And yet, one by one, even those who clung to charms and rituals fell, proving that no superstition could hold back the tide of death. Nights were the worst. When the work was done and silence filled the trenches, the men were left alone with their thoughts. Every ache in their bodies, every twitch of muscle, became a signal of impending doom. They lay awake, listening to their own breathing, wondering if it would sound the same in the morning. Sleep brought no relief, only nightmares. Some dreamed of digging their own graves, lowering themselves into pits, feeling the dirt fall over their faces. Others dreamed of corpses rising, pulling them down into the earth. They awoke with the taste of soil in their mouths, coughing, scratching at their throats, unable to tell dream from reality. This constant awareness of mortality created a strange bond among them. They did not speak of it openly. Words gave fear too much power. But they knew. A cough silenced a group. A man wiping his brow too often drew worried glances. They watched each other with a mixture of loyalty and suspicion, torn between the instinct to help and the need to protect themselves. When one of them fell ill, the others moved quickly, carrying him away before the sickness could spread. It was both mercy and fear, a way to shield themselves from hope as much as from danger. The city outside shared this paranoia. People avoided not just the caveros, but anyone who coughed or sneezed. Families turned on one another, locking sick relatives in their rooms, sliding food under the door until the moans stopped. Friends crossed the street rather than risk a handshake. Even the air felt dangerous, as if every breath carried invisible daggers. To live during the plague was to live in constant suspicion, where trust itself had died alongside faith. For the caveros, however, the fear was sharper because they could not run from it. Their work placed them in direct contact with what everyone else fled. They were forced to hold the infected, to breathe in their last exhalations, to drag their bodies even as their own hands itched from flea bites. They were like men standing on the edge of a burning house, told to carry water into the flames, while everyone else ran for safety. Their bravery was not born from choice, but from necessity, and beneath the hard faces and silent labor, their terror was unrelenting. And yet they carried on. Each morning they returned to the pits, knowing that death walked beside them. Their fear was constant, but so was their endurance. They shoveled not because they believed they would live, but because there was no other path. The city needed them, and survival, even temporary survival, depended on their hands. They worked in the shadow of their own mortality, each cough, each fevered moment, a reminder that tomorrow they might not return. And still, they kept digging, burying not only the dead, but also the fragile hope that they themselves could somehow escape the fate they served. Entire families arrived at the pits together, their bodies bound by death in the same way they had once been bound by blood. The carts creaked under the weight of mothers clutching children in their arms, husbands and wives laid side by side, siblings tangled in their final embrace. The plague did not move carefully through a household. It consumed it whole, leaving entire homes silent in the span of a week. For the caveros, this sight became common, though never less devastating. They no longer carried individuals. They carried lineages, erasing entire names from the city with a single heave of the shovel. The children were the hardest to bear. Their small bodies weighed little, yet the weight pressed heavily on the soul. Wrapped in thin cloth, often in the very clothes they had worn to bed, they looked less like corpses and more like children sleeping. Some still clutched toys, a wooden horse, a doll of rags, objects their parents had not been able to pry from their hands even after death. The men lowered them quickly, not because they wished to rush, but because to linger too long was unbearable. To look at their faces was to imagine their own sons and daughters, waiting at home, perhaps coughing already in their beds. The horror was not just in their innocence, but in the number. Trenches filled with rows of children, their tiny forms swallowed by dirt before their names could be spoken aloud. The caveros sometimes marked the graves with a cross, scratched hastily into wood, but the crosses blurred together as the fields expanded. Soon there were too many to count, too many to distinguish. Each new row was simply added to the last, and the individuality of each life disappeared beneath the earth. The plague did not allow for memory, it demanded erasure. Parents often followed their children within days, if not hours. It was not uncommon for a cart to carry both mother and infant, their deaths so close together that their bodies shared the same shroud. Fathers, once pillars of strength, arrived soon after, their eyes still open as though searching for the family already gone. In the pits, husbands and wives were lowered side by side, though not by choice but by necessity. Death reunited them in the only way possible: anonymity. The trenches cared nothing for vows or bonds, only for the speed with which it could devour. For the caveros, this sight carved deeper wounds than even the stench or the decay. They whispered among themselves about the cruelty of a world where children were buried before they could even speak their prayers, where mothers nursed one day and lay in a pit the next. Some men swore they would never marry, never bring children into such a cursed existence. Others held onto their families more tightly, desperate to believe that their labor could somehow protect those at home. Yet deep down, they knew the truth. The plague did not discriminate, and no shovel could dig fast enough to save a loved one once sickness had entered the door. Villagers sometimes arrived at the pits, begging for mercy, asking the caveros to bury their families together. "Do not separate them," they pleaded, pressing coins or bread into the men's hands. The caveros often honored these requests when they could, lowering bodies side by side, covering them with soil as though tucking them into a shared bed. But such moments were rare luxuries. More often, the press of bodies was so great that there was no room for choice. Families were torn apart in death, as in life, scattered among strangers in trenches too wide to remember. Children left behind suffered another kind of fate. Orphans wandered the streets, barefoot, coughing, searching for scraps of food. They begged the caveros to tell them where their parents lay, pointing to the endless pits and asking which mound of dirt belonged to their mother. The men had no answers. They could only shake their heads, their eyes heavy with pity. The children would cry into the earth, hoping their voices reached the ones buried below, but the soil gave no reply. The plague not only killed the living, it left survivors trapped in a void of unanswered questions. The caveros sometimes carried home these images, unable to shake them from their minds. One man spoke of a child's body slipping from his hands as he lowered it, the tiny face staring back at him from the dirt. Another told of a mother and daughter locked in an embrace so tight they could not be separated. their bodies buried together in the same posture they had died in. These memories haunted them more than rats, fleas, or stench. They were not just burying strangers, they were burying stories, futures, generations that would never come. Even the clergy, once the guardians of family bonds in death, faltered under the weight of so many lost households. They could not bless each child individually, could not whisper prayers over every couple. Instead, they offered hurried gestures over trenches, their voices hoarse, their faith tested. The Caviros saw the despair in their eyes, the quiet acknowledgement that the order of the world had fractured beyond repair. If families could vanish in a week, what hope was left for those still clinging to life? And yet, amidst this devastation, there were moments of startling tenderness. A Caviro would sometimes pause, brushing dirt gently from a child's face before lowering it into the ground. Another might place a flower, plucked from a nearby field, beside a mother's body, a small rebellion against the plague's cruelty. These gestures did not change the outcome, but they gave meaning where none remained. In silence, they reminded the men that even in a world drowning in death, humanity could still flicker, however faintly, but the plague was relentless, and sentiment could not slow it. Each family buried was followed by another and another, until the very idea of kinship blurred into anonymity. The Caveros learned to steel themselves, to lift children without pausing, to cover families without prayer, because behind them the carts kept coming. And as they shoveled more dirt onto another household swallowed whole, they could not help but wonder if one day, soon, it would be their own family carried to the pits, waiting for the same men to bury them beside strangers. The weight of the labor was not carried only in their arms, but deep inside their minds. The Caveros became men split in two, one part mechanical, hardened by routine, the other fragile, haunted by what their eyes could never unsee. At the pits, they moved like machines, lifting, dragging, tossing soil, their bodies reacting faster than thought. But when the work ended, when the shovels rested and silence returned, the faces of the dead came flooding back. They remembered every child's small hand slipping limp from their grasp, every family huddled together in death, every stare of glassy eyes that refused to close. The dead filled their nights as surely as they filled the trenches. The psychological strain left scars as real as any wound. Some men grew numb, their emotions buried as deeply as the corpses they lowered. They stopped speaking, their eyes vacant, their laughter gone. Others broke under the pressure, screaming at shadows, lashing out at comrades, clawing at the dirt as though trying to escape. Madness was not rare, but expected. To live surrounded by death without succumbing to despair seemed unnatural. Even the strongest began to fracture, whispering to themselves as they worked, muttering half prayers, half curses, their voices frayed by exhaustion. One of the cruelest torments was memory itself. The Caveros could never separate the dead from the living. When they looked at their own families, they imagined them pale and still, lying on the same carts they unloaded each day. A wife coughing at night became a premonition of loss. A child's fevered brow conjured visions of burial. They could not escape the thought that their labor was rehearsal for what they might soon endure personally. Many grew distant from their loved ones, afraid to let tenderness deepen bonds that the plague could sever at any moment. Love became dangerous, because love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant heartbreak. Some tried to shield themselves with dark humor. In the trenches, bitter laughter echoed between shovels striking the soil. They joked about the dead rising to help with the digging, about rats demanding their share of wages, about fleas choosing which man would be next. The laughter was hollow, forced, a fragile barrier against despair. But when night fell, the same men who had laughed found themselves shaking in their beds, unable to banish the images from their minds. Humor could not keep away nightmares. Others sought solace in drink. Tavern keepers often barred them, but wine found its way into their hands regardless. Strong spirits dulled the senses, blurred the faces of the dead, softened the memory of screams and sobs. Yet the relief was temporary. In the morning the headaches were worse, the bodies heavier, the pits deeper. Drink could erase nothing. It only postponed the breaking point. And when the drink ran out, reality returned sharper than before. There were also those who turned to faith, clinging desperately to rituals even as the church faltered. A man might whisper the Lord's Prayer over every 10th body, or carry a rosary in his pocket, beads worn smooth by his fingers. Some drew crosses in the dirt before beginning to dig, believing the gesture would shield them from madness, if not from disease. But faith was fragile when faced with trenches full of priests and monks, their bodies lowered like all the rest. The Caveros prayed, but their prayers often ended in silence, unanswered, leaving them more hollow than before. Whispers of superstition filled the void where faith broke down. The men spoke of curses, of restless spirits watching from beneath the soil, of shadows that lingered too long at the edges of torchlight. They swore the air around the pits carried not only stench but voices, faint murmurs rising from the ground. Some claimed to see eyes glimmering in the darkness when no torches burned. Whether these were hallucinations from exhaustion or something more, they spread unease among the workers, each man silently wondering if he had lost his mind or if the world itself had slipped into nightmare. The psychological toll also revealed itself in the body. Men chewed their nails until their fingers bled, scratched their arms raw, or ground their teeth until they cracked. Sleep was scarce, and when it came, it was filled with visions of collapsing trenches, of being buried alive among the dead. Many woke, gasping, convinced the smell of rot still filled their nostrils, even within their own homes. Some admitted to hearing phantom carts creaking down empty streets at night, as though the dead continued arriving long after the pits had closed. The line between waking and dreaming blurred until both became the same torment. The isolation of their role deepened this suffering. No one wanted to hear their stories, to carry the weight of their memories. Neighbors avoided them, priests blessed them only from a distance, families shrank from their touch. The silence imposed upon them outside the pits was as heavy as the silence within. With no one to confide in, their grief festered unspoken, poisoning them slowly. They bore the burden alone, each man a vessel overflowing with horrors that had no outlet. And yet, in this crucible of despair, some found a strange resilience. They learned to compartmentalize, to bury their emotions as deeply as they buried the dead. They forged bonds with one another, silent pacts of survival in which words were unnecessary. A hand on a shoulder, a shared jug of water, a glance of understanding in the torchlight, these became lifeline. They did not erase the torment, but they reminded the men that they were not entirely alone. Still, the cracks widened with each passing day. For every man who endured, another broke. Some vanished into the night, abandoning the city, never to be seen again. Others ended their lives rather than continue a task that devoured both body and soul. The work demanded more than muscle. It demanded sanity, faith, and humanity, and often stripped all three away. The Caveros were not only gravediggers of the dead, but of themselves, burying fragments of their spirit with every shovelful of earth. And as the trenches widened and the bells of morning remained silent, they began to wonder whether the plague's greatest cruelty was not death itself, but the slow erosion of the living carved day by day into hollow shadows of the men they once had been. For the Caveros, survival did not mean being alive. It meant enduring the unbearable, carrying memories that would never rest, even when the earth finally swallowed its last body. The work did not end with the setting of the sun. When darkness fell, the Caveros remained at the trenches, torches flickering against the walls of earth that yawned open like wounds. The night belonged to the dead as much as the day, and the bodies did not wait politely for morning. Carts still arrived, wheels groaning on cobblestones, carrying their grotesque cargo beneath the veil of stars. If anything, the labor grew more terrifying when the world went quiet, for in the silence of night, every sound was sharper. The snap of a shovel piercing the soil, the creak of ropes straining under weight, the muffled thud of bodies striking the ground. The torchlight distorted everything. Flames spat and hissed, throwing long shadows across the pits. The men appeared as giants one moment, shrunken phantoms the next. The bodies themselves seemed to twitch under the shifting glow, as if caught between life and death. Exhaustion blurred perception until imagination filled the gaps. More than one Cavero swore he saw a hand move, a chest rise, or an eye glint back at him. Perhaps it was only the tricks of the fire, or perhaps it was the mind's rebellion against endless labor. But once such visions took root, they were impossible to forget. Night also magnified the stench. In the still air, the odor of decomposition clung more heavily, pressing into lungs with no breeze to carry it away. The men tied rags tighter around their faces, dipped in vinegar or soaked in herbs, but the smell broke through, settling deep inside. Torches burned low, their smoke mingling with the stench until the air became a choking fog. Men coughed constantly, their throats raw, their stomachs turning. Some vomited into the pits themselves before returning to their shovels, too weary to step away. There was danger beyond the dead as well. The city at night was not empty. It was alive with scavengers, both human and animal. Dogs prowled the trenches, snarling over scraps, their eyes glowing red in the torchlight. Rats grew bolder, climbing directly onto the bodies, undeterred by human presence. And then there were the desperate living, thieves who stalked the work sites, hoping to strip rings, necklaces, or even boots from corpses before they were covered. The Caveros sometimes caught them, dragging them away, but not always. In truth, the men often turned a blind eye. Who were they to judge when they themselves were despised by the very people they served? The work was colder at night, too. The damp earth clung to boots and legs, the chill seeping into bones already sore from endless strain. Sweat cooled quickly on their backs, leaving them shivering even as they labored. Fingers numbed, blisters split open, and every movement was slower, heavier. Yet they could not stop. If they delayed, bodies piled higher, the backlog growing until it became insurmountable. So they pressed on, hour after hour, until the line between dusk and dawn blurred into the monotony of fatigue. For some, the night was worse because of silence. During the day, the noise of carts, the cries of mourners, and the bustle of the city provided a grim distraction. But at night, there was only the scrape of shovels, the thud of dirt, and the occasional crackle of fire. The silence was suffocating, broken only by strange sounds. The squeal of rats, the flutter of unseen wings, the distant sobbing of a widow bard from the pits. The men often whispered to each other to break the stillness, but whispers could not drown the feeling that the darkness itself was listening. Superstition thrived in those hours. Men muttered about spirits rising, about the souls of the unblessed dead wandering near the trenches. Some claimed to see figures moving at the edge of the torchlight, shapes that vanished when approached. Others insisted the moans they heard were not rats or wind, but the voices of the buried. Fear made men cross themselves repeatedly, clutching charms or whispering prayers even as they shoveled. And yet, even when terror crawled under their skin, they did not stop. Fear was a luxury. Work was survival. One of the most harrowing tasks was when the trenches overflowed, forcing the men to dig deeper into the night. Shovels struck roots, rocks, even frozen ground, sparks flying in the dim light. The pits collapsed easily in darkness, soil crumbling onto bodies, sometimes burying men up to their knees before comrades pulled them free. Every collapse was a reminder that the living, too, could be swallowed at any moment. The earth did not care whether it claimed the dead or the exhausted souls tasked with burying them. Exhaustion made accidents common. A torch dropped into the trench could ignite cloth or straw, setting corpses alight in a sudden, horrifying blaze. The smell of burning flesh was unbearable, driving men to gag and stumble even as they tried to extinguish the fire with dirt. Tools slipped from weary hands, cutting skin, breaking toes. Some men fell into the pits themselves, scrambling out with frantic strength, clawing against the bodies beneath them. Their comrades laughed bitterly afterward, but the fear lingered, the knowledge that one day they might not be able to climb out. And yet, despite everything, dawn always came. The sky shifted from black to gray. The torches burned out, and the city began to stir again. The caveros looked at the pits, at the bodies still waiting, and knew the cycle would repeat. Night did not bring rest. It only deepened the torment, stretched time into something endless. They returned home with the taste of smoke and rot still in their mouths, collapsing onto straw beds, only to rise again when the carts returned. For the caveros, night work was not just an extension of day. It was an amplification of everything they endured. The fear, the stench, the exhaustion, the loneliness, all grew sharper under the cloak of darkness. And as they walked away from the pits, with their torches guttering low, they carried with them the certainty that, even in daylight, the shadows of night would never leave their minds. Their tools were as weary as the men who wielded them. Shovels, picks, and spades were not crafted for endless labor, and yet they were forced into service day and night, biting into earth that seemed to resist every strike. Metal dulled quickly, edges bent, handles splintered beneath the strain. A shovel that had once belonged to a farmer, designed for turning soil and planting crops, was now used to carve trenches wide enough to swallow entire neighborhoods. The wood absorbed sweat and rot, growing slick, cracked, and blackened until it felt like holding death itself. And still, the caveros clung to these tools as if they were lifelines, because without them, their labor and the fragile order of the city would collapse completely. When tools broke, replacements were scarce. Blacksmiths were overwhelmed, their forges tasked with producing weapons and nails for barricades, rather than grave-digging implements. Some caveros repaired their own, hammering bent blades against stones or binding broken handles with strips of leather torn from shoes. Others grew desperate, carving crude spades from wood, though these splintered after only a few strokes. There were moments when a man, finding his shovel split in two, resorted to using his bare hands, clawing at the dirt with fingernails that bled. The trench had to be dug, whether with iron, wood, or flesh. Ingenuity was born of necessity. One man sharpened a bone, a femur pulled from an older grave, into a digging tool, hacking at the clay until the others joined in, half horrified, half impressed. Another scavenged rusted blades from abandoned workshops, fashioning them into makeshift picks. They wrapped cloth around handles to soften the strain on their palms, though the cloth quickly soaked with sweat, blood, and soil. These tools were not just instruments of labor, they became symbols of resilience, proof that even when stripped of resources, the men found ways to keep the pits open. But each invention came at a cost, a reminder that even iron wore down under the weight of so much death. The caveros' clothing was no better. They owned no protective gear, no armor against the plague that seeped from every body they touched. Most wore the same woolen tunics and leather boots day after day, the fabric stiff with grime, the soles eaten through by constant use. Gloves, when they had them, were thin and quickly torn, leaving skin exposed to fluids and fleas. Some tied rags around their faces, soaked in vinegar or wine, hoping to block the stench and the sickness in the air. The cloths burned their throats and lungs, but they wore them still, convinced that any barrier, no matter how small, might hold back death. The garments absorbed everything. Sweat mixed with rot, until the men themselves reeked like the pits they dug. Even when they returned home, the smell clung, seeping into straw beds, into hair, into the very walls of their dwellings. Wives tried to scrub the fabric with lye and ash, but the odor never left. Some men burned their own clothes after weeks of use, stripping naked and walking home in shame, preferring exposure to the certainty of being recognized by their stench. But new clothes were rare, and soon the cycle began again, the fresh tunic soiled within days, heavy with the weight of work. Footwear was its own torment, the trenches filled with water when rain came, turning the earth into sucking mud that clung to boots like chains. Leather cracked, seams burst, soles peeled away. Many men worked barefoot, their feet cut by stones, swollen by infection, frozen by cold nights. Some wrapped their feet in cloth, binding them tightly, but the cloth dissolved quickly in muck. The ground consumed everything, punishing each step, each shift of weight, until their feet were as raw as their hands. Even their bodies became tools. Hands turned to claws, skin hardened into callus, backs bent from the endless repetition of digging. Joints swelled, shoulders locked, and muscles ached with a pain that never faded. They pushed themselves beyond exhaustion, their bodies no longer their own but extensions of the shovels they held. A man could not separate himself from his labor. His very shape was altered by it. To see a cavero was to see a body carved by the plague, not in infection, but in relentless toil. And yet, despite the misery, there was pride in these battered tools. A shovel, though dented and dull, was passed between men with reverence, for it meant work could continue. A patched boot, though leaking, carried a man one more day closer to survival. They clung to these objects as though they were charms, reminders that they were still alive, still able to resist the collapse that pressed in from all sides. Tools were not luxuries. They were the thin line between order and chaos, between the living and the dead. Stories spread among them about tools taking on lives of their own. One man swore his shovel groaned when it struck the ground, as though weary of labor. Another insisted his boots guided him toward trenches, even when he wished to flee. These were superstitions, perhaps born from exhaustion, but they carried a grain of truth. The caveros and their tools were inseparable. To abandon one was to abandon the other, to surrender to the inevitability of collapse. The city noticed their tools too, though not with admiration. People recoiled from the sight of shovels slick with mud and blood, of boots crusted with filth, of rags stained beyond recognition. These objects became emblems of contagion, marks of the plague itself. Shops barred them, churches turned them away, mothers pulled their children close. It was not just the men who were shunned, but the very objects they carried, symbols of labor that kept the city alive, yet branded them untouchable. In time, even the tools themselves seemed to carry death. A shovel used to bury hundreds of bodies felt cursed, heavy with more than soil. Clothes that had seen too many nights at the trenches were burned in desperate fires, the smoke rising like a second funeral pyre. And yet, for every tool discarded, another was needed. The cycle was unending, and the men could not escape it. Their lives were measured not in years or months, but in the wear of iron, the tearing of cloth, the splintering of wood. For the caveros, survival meant keeping their tools alive even as their own bodies faltered. The breaking of a shovel was as dreadful as the breaking of a bone, the loss of a pair of boots as devastating as the loss of food. And so they labored on, gripping what little they had, even as their tools became mirrors of themselves, battered, scarred, and always one step closer to breaking under the weight of the plague. Faith had always been the anchor of their lives. In every birth, every harvest, every funeral, the hand of God was seen and felt, the words of priests giving order to chaos. But in the midst of the plague, that anchor began to slip. The caveros were men who saw death so closely that belief could no longer remain untouched. Every day they buried priests who had once preached of divine protection, monks who had promised that prayer could shield the faithful, nuns who had devoted their lives to mercy. If even the holy fell into their pits, covered by dirt like any common sinner, what did that say of heaven's justice? The question hung in the air heavier than the smell of rot. At first, they tried to hold on. Men crossed themselves mechanically before lowering a body, muttered a prayer under their breath, or pressed a rosary between fingers slick with sweat. Some still paused before a trench, asking forgiveness for what they were forced to do. But as the days bled into weeks, faith became harder to grip. The sight of entire monasteries emptied of life, the sound of church bells silenced, the image of a priest's body swelling and splitting like any other, these images pressed doubt into even the strongest believers. If God was watching, why did his chosen fall with the rest? Rumor spread that the plague was punishment, a divine scourge sent to cleanse the world of sin. Some caveros half believed it, wondering if their own labor was part of that punishment, forced to touch what others would not, marked as servants of death itself. Others rejected the idea entirely, scoffing at sermons that spoke of God's will while their hands trembled from bearing children. How could innocence be sin? How could a babe still wrapped in swaddling cloth deserve such cruelty? These questions haunted them more deeply than the fever that stalked their bodies. Superstition grew where faith faltered. Men carried talismans, small bones carved into charms, or clutched sprigs of rosemary and lavender, not only to mask the stench, but to ward off unseen spirits. Some whispered incantations as they shoveled old words inherited from grandmothers long before the church had claimed authority. Others swore they felt the gaze of restless souls in the pits, watching, waiting, furious that no proper rite had been spoken over them. In the silence left by absent priests, the Caviros created their own rituals, throwing 3 handfuls of dirt for luck, tapping shovels against the ground before lifting, refusing to whistle in the trenches for fear it would summon wandering spirits. Yet even in their doubts, faith never disappeared entirely. It twisted, reshaped by necessity. Some believed that by enduring such horrors they were already performing penance for the sins of mankind. Their labor, though despised by others, was holy in its own way, a sacrifice that allowed the living to cling to order for one more day. A few even found strange pride in this thought, that their blistered hands were as much a sermon as any spoken from a pulpit. They were, unwillingly, priests of the earth, shepherding souls, not with words, but with shovels and sweat. Still, many could not reconcile what they saw with what they once believed. The burial of children was the deepest wound. No prayer seemed large enough to explain why infants were lowered into the ground before they had even learned to speak. The Caviros stood over those tiny forms and felt faith crack like old wood. Some grew angry, cursing aloud at the heavens as they tossed dirt, daring God to answer. Others fell silent, no longer crossing themselves, no longer whispering words they feared were empty. For them, silence was safer than betrayal. Even the clergy themselves betrayed the fragile hope. Some priests abandoned their parishes, fleeing into the countryside with whatever wealth they could gather. Others refused to enter plague houses, leaving families to die without absolution. The Caviros buried these failures too, lowering the corrupted alongside the devout, unable to distinguish the one from the other once death had claimed them. Trust in the church unraveled with every coffin, and the men who once leaned on faith found only suspicion and resentment in its place. But not all was despair. In the trenches, small sparks of belief still flickered. A man might pause to place a flower in the dirt, whispering a blessing not taught by the church, but born from his own heart. Another might carve a cross into a wooden marker, not because he trusted the priests, but because he could not bear to let a grave remain nameless. These gestures were not about doctrine, they were about humanity. In those moments, the Caviros discovered that faith was not only about grand cathedrals or Latin prayers. It could also be found in the quiet refusal to let death erase the dignity of the living. And yet, the doubt remained. Every trench filled with priests and children, every unanswered prayer, every night when silence pressed heavier than hymns, all of it reminded them that faith was fragile. The Caviros walked a narrow line between belief and despair, between superstition and surrender, and no sermon could guide them. Their shovels became their gospel, the earth their scripture, the pits their cathedral. And as they lowered yet another body into the ground, they asked themselves silently whether heaven still listened, or if the silence itself was the only answer they would ever receive. The survivors among the Caviros bore scars that no shovel could bury. Long after the plague loosened its grip, they carried its weight in their bones, in their minds, in the silence of their own homes. To live on was not always a triumph. It was often another form of punishment. They had endured what few could, handling thousands of corpses, inhaling the stench of rot day and night, watching entire families vanish into the earth. Those memories did not leave them when the bells rang again, when markets reopened, when fields began to grow wheat once more. They lingered like shadows, following each step, whispering in each quiet moment. Survival, for them, meant living in a world forever changed, and in bodies that could never return to what they once were. The stigma remained too. When the city tried to stitch itself back together, people looked at the Caviros not with gratitude, but with unease. They were remembered not as saviors, but as men who had walked too closely with death. Neighbors crossed themselves when they passed, whispering that their touch carried misfortune, that their presence still stank of the pits. Some were barred from taverns, others refused from guilds. Even those who returned to their trades, farmers, smiths, laborers, found their work avoided, their goods left unsold. It was as though they had absorbed the plague into their very skin, branded forever by what they had done. Their survival, in the eyes of others, was not a blessing, but a reminder of horror. Many found themselves alone, not by choice, but by abandonment. Wives who had fled during the plague did not return. Children, grown fearful of their fathers, distanced themselves as if afraid the curse lingered still. The Caviros, once part of the community's fragile lifeline, were now outcasts in peacetime. Some wandered to other towns, carrying with them only the tools that had once been their companions, but found the same reception elsewhere. The word gravedigger became synonymous not only with death, but with omen, and few wanted such men among them. Isolation, which had begun during the plague, became a permanent condition of survival. The memories, however, were heavier than exile. Nightmares dragged them back to the trenches even years later. They woke with dirt in their mouths, coughing as though suffocated by soil. They heard phantom carts rattling through empty streets, phantom cries of mothers begging for one more prayer over their children. Some confessed they could no longer look at freshly turned soil without gagging, for every patch of earth became another grave in their eyes. The plague had ended, but inside their minds it never had. The past was not something to remember. It was something that clung, refusing to let go. The body also betrayed them. Years of labor had left them bent and broken, backs permanently hunched, hands gnarled, joints swollen from digging through frozen clay and sodden earth. Some limped from old injuries where pits had collapsed around them. Others coughed endlessly, their lungs scarred by the stench of decomposition and the constant inhalation of dust and smoke. They were men prematurely aged, carrying the bodies of the dead and the deformities of their own flesh. To the outside world, the plague was history. To them, it was written into their bones. Some tried to find meaning in what they had endured. They told themselves they had performed a duty that no one else would take on, that their labor had prevented the city from drowning in corpses, that without them, the living might not have survived at all. This thought gave them a grim pride, though it was rarely shared aloud. Others rejected the idea, believing instead that they had been cursed, condemned to carry the weight of a task that stole their humanity one shovel at a time. Survival became a burden because it forced them to wrestle daily with the question of why they lived when so many others did not. Stories began to circulate, not of gratitude, but of unease. Children grew up hearing whispers that the Caveros had made bargains with death, that their survival came at the cost of their souls. Some claimed they saw them wandering graveyards at night, speaking to the earth as if expecting an answer. The line between superstition and memory blurred until the survivors became figures of myth, half feared, half forgotten, always bound to the pits they had once dug. The men themselves did little to refute it. Silence was easier than explanation. And in truth, how could words ever capture what they had seen? The world had changed around them too. Families that once filled the streets were gone, houses stood empty or were reclaimed by weeds, and churches rang their bells again, though their notes now sounded hollow. Life resumed, but it was not the same life. The plague had carved a wound into society, and though it scabbed over, the scar remained. For the Caveros, that scar was sharper still. They did not just live in a city altered by death, they had helped shape that alteration, spade by spade, trench by trench. They were both victims and architects of the silence that followed. And yet, despite everything, there were moments when survival revealed its own strange beauty. The men who had seen so much death sometimes cherished life more fiercely than others. A child's laughter struck them like a miracle. The warmth of bread, the comfort of firelight, the embrace of someone unafraid, these became treasures richer than gold. They had walked so closely with mortality that every small act of living felt like defiance. The world might have treated them as shadows, but in the quiet of their hearts, they knew the value of endurance. Still, the question of legacy loomed. Would they be remembered as protectors who kept cities from drowning in corpses, or as cursed men who carried death wherever they went? The answer was never clear. What was certain was that survival did not mean freedom. The plague had ended, but its echo followed them to the last breath. And when their own bodies were finally lowered into the earth, many wondered if they too would be forgotten in anonymous graves, indistinguishable from the thousands they had once buried. Survival, after all, was not an ending. It was another chapter in a story that never seemed to stop demanding payment. And, as they lay awake, staring into the darkness, they feared that the true price of living was not life itself, but the burden of remembering.